3 years ago, if I told you that Travis Kelce was going to destroy your fantasy team, you would probably laugh in my face. Travis Kelce is one of the best players to have on your fantasy football teams and is one of the best players in the NFL. He typically gives you the ultimate leg up against every single opponent on your schedule in fantasy football. Today, his draft price is as high as it's ever been, but that's not even my biggest problem with drafting Travis Kelce in 2023. The reason that drafting Travis Kelce will destroy your fantasy football team in 2023 runs much deeper than that. So since I brought up the draft capital it takes to get Travis Kelce, let's go into that. So he's currently going 6th overall on Underdog ADP right now. Obviously, he's the tight end one. Nobody is disputing that. He is such a fantastic player. He should be going as the tight end one. Like I said, he's obviously such a great player. When you look at Travis Kelce in comparison to other tight ends throughout NFL history, there's no wonder why people are so hyped about him in fantasy football, because he's one of the best NFL tight ends in the entire league. And you can see on the screen right now, over the last 3 years, these are what his numbers have been. So obviously, with the exception of 2020, he has been blowing by every other tight end in fantasy points per game and total fantasy points in all of fantasy football. Every year except that 1 year where Mark Andrews had a great year as well, he has been blowing by every single player as far as tight ends go in fantasy football. But when a player enters the top 10 of ADP on the fantasy app that can win you the most money, we need to be more critical of them. And I take it upon myself to do that for you guys because I want us to be prepared as a community for what we can expect if you draft Travis Kelce at number 6. So let's look back at those 3 years for Travis Kelce. So you can see 2022 on the screen right now. He had 8.9 targets per game, 78.7 yards per game, 12.2 yards per reception, 0.7 touchdowns per game, and 15.4 fantasy points per game. Now you drop down to 2021, right? So you got 8.4 targets a game, 70.3 yards per game, 12.2 yards per reception again, 0.56 touchdowns per game, 13.6 fantasy points per game. And then drop down to 2020 and you see 9.7 targets per game, 94.4 yards per game, 13.5 yards per reception, 0.73 touchdowns per game, and 14.1 fantasy points per game. So let's discuss the takeaways right now that we can take away from those numbers. So obviously in 2022 and 2021, his volume was basically the same, 8.9, 8.4, but it was a drop off from 2020 when he had 9.7, almost 10 targets per game. So that is a drop off that we do need to consider here with Travis Kelce. Now, as far as yards per game, there's kind of a little bit, it's all over the map right now, as you can see, right? He had the most yards per game in 2020. He had a great season that year, and then it's dropped ever since then. And 2022, it saw a little bit of a resurgence, but not that much. And as far as fantasy points per game, he did average the most fantasy points per game in 2022, which is very interesting because when you combine the lower volume with the lower yards per game, why did that happen? We'll discuss that in a little bit later on. But what you can also take away from this is really when you look at it, he is getting true wide receiver one volume in fantasy football. And in some cases, he's getting the amount of touchdowns per game as a lot of wide receiver ones do in fantasy football. So when you look at last year's top 5 wide receivers in fantasy football, he's got roughly the same amount of targets per game as last year's wide receiver 4 and 5. And last year's wide receiver 4 and 5 were Stephon Diggs and AJ Brown. So when you can see on the screen right there, you can see that it's roughly the same, right? Stephon Diggs had 9.2 targets per game and AJ Brown had 8.5 targets per game. So Travis Kelce is basically sitting in the middle. And this is the perfect segue into why he will destroy your team in 2023. And there are 2 different roots of the reason, so let's get into it. So like I said earlier, since he is going at number 6 overall in Underdog right now, we need to look at this as closely as we can, because once a player enters inside the top 10, we need to scrutinize every single aspect of how they score their fantasy points. So when you look at Underdog ADP right now, there are 4 wide receivers and 1 running back that are going ahead of Travis Kelce. So what we'll do right now is let's just take Christian McCaffrey out of the equation right now. Let's just focus on the wide receivers in comparison to Travis Kelce, because essentially what you're seeing right now is Travis Kelce is basically the wide receiver 5 off of the board right now. So like we just went over, right? Travis Kelce is basically seeing the same amount of targets per game as last year's wide receiver 4 and wide receiver 5 in fantasy football. So where is the difference right here, right? Let's take a closer look to see how closely they align as far as fantasy points per game and where they got the majority of those fantasy points from. So Travis Kelce averaged 15.4 fantasy points per game in 2022. Stefon Diggs averaged 15.7 fantasy points per game. And AJ Brown averaged 15 fantasy points per game. So as you can see there, it's roughly the same amount of fantasy points per game. There's really not much of a difference when you just look at it from that surface level, right? And what you can also see is they have roughly the same amount of touchdowns per game as well. Both of those guys, Diggs and AJ Brown, had 0.65 touchdowns per game. So basically, same amount of fantasy points per game and same amount of touchdowns per game. When we look closely enough, though, you can see the difference. Both Stefon Diggs and AJ Brown average more yards per reception than Travis Kelce does. Now, that number may sound pretty insignificant to you, right? It's not like it's that big of a deal in some people's eyes, and it shouldn't be that much of a cause for concern, right? Well, we'll get back into that in a minute, but first of all, let me reiterate this right now. Travis Kelce is an unbelievable player. Not only is he one of the best players in the NFL, but he is also one of the ultimate outliers at his position. And while we did not see regression in his game in 2022, we need to remember two things. First off is that Travis Kelce, when you can see on the screen right now, he has only had 3 seasons with double-digit touchdown totals. And the second thing that we need to keep in mind is that he is 33 right now, and he will be 34 in October. So when you look at how fantasy points are scored, when you look at yards per reception versus touchdowns, yards per reception has one major advantage over touchdowns. It is much more consistent year over year, and that makes it so much easier to predict what will happen for the next coming season. Especially when a player is super young, which AJ Brown is still in his mid-20s. So it is a lot easier to project yards per reception year over year than it is touchdowns per year. So essentially what this does is yards per reception gives us a much more stable baseline of fantasy points. Because here's the thing, even if all of those guys, Diggs, AJ Brown, and Travis Kelce, even if all of them had some negative touchdown regression this year and they were all around 6-7 touchdowns, AJ Brown and Stefon Diggs will still be better fantasy options than Travis Kelce just based on yards per reception. What we have to understand here is this price for Travis Kelce, this is a price for perfection, man. We are expecting him to do better than he did last year and to still hold up double-digit touchdowns, which, like I said, he's a great player, but that is a very unpredictable number, and that makes him way less stable in fantasy football. I would much rather have a wide receiver with my first pick, and that leads me to the second root of the problem. So first of all, we need to remember the underdog format right now. The underdog format is not a 2 wide receiver format and 1 flex format. It is a 3 wide receiver format with 1 flex. So on any given week, the likelihood that you could be having 4 wide receivers scoring points for you in best ball formats is not unrealistic. It is actually a decently high number because you will at least have 3. Obviously, with a 3 wide receiver format, you're at least going to have 3 wide receivers scoring for you every single week. The likelihood that it could be 4 is not that low. And as a result of this format of 3 wide receivers, 14 wide receivers are going inside the top 23 picks in underdog drafts right now. So if you are sitting at number 6 and you pick Travis Kelce, you will likely end up getting Chris Olave and DK Metcalf as your top 2 wide receivers. Best case scenario, T. Higgins falls to you, and you could grab T. Higgins as your wide receiver 2. And then after that, rounds 4, 5, 6, 7, rounds after that, you're going to have to fill other positions on your roster. So if you are staring down Travis Kelce at number 6 overall, remember, you are unnecessarily capping your team's fantasy upside. This is not a good draft strategy. And if you want to know what the best draft strategy is for 2023 fantasy football, click on this video right here.